So as I was saying, this highlights an important fact about professors and some of the people putting on this event. We're not perfect. So if you look at the program book, you will see a long title. Has absolutely nothing to do with what Seb is going to talk to you about today. I actually don't know what he's going to talk to you about today, so this is going to be a mystery talk from Dr. Giwa. It's all yours, Seb.
Thanks a lot. Hi, everyone. So I'm Sebastian Giwa, Dr. Giwa, or just Seb, whichever you prefer. Founder of, up to today, 3 different biotech companies that each are going quite well and quite successful. So I'm going to go quite quick and stop me if anything is unclear or if I somehow went too fast. So starting instead of from the very beginning, I was going to start a little bit at the end. So here's, relatively recently at the end of the Obama presidency, I got the opportunity to talk about the same things that we're going to talk about now at the White House because they're so important. And that also led to a paper with some of the world's leading scientists and physicians. So Professor Bischoff is one of the authors on here, but also Nobel Prize winners and head of some of the biggest medical associations in the world and so on. So where did I come from? Well, I'm going to talk a bit about transplantation. And in some ways, I'm a bit of a transplant myself. So my mother met my father in London. She came from a small village or very small town in Sweden. And my dad was a refugee from Ghana. And she was just going to go to study a little bit of English before she started university. Ended up staying there 16 years and 2 kids and marriage and all of that stuff. And I grew up in some of the roughest areas of both London and Gothenburg, which is like the industrial second largest city in Sweden. But kind of found ways to break out of that. And at this time I had a lot of interest for biology, math, and chemistry. But what really changed kind of my life was that I got really interested in leadership and politics. And you, of course, can't understand what it's saying, but this is one of the top newspapers in Sweden, where basically I had become the president of the National Youth Council of the country. That led to a lot of different things. I worked towards the United Nations, Kofi Annan when he was Secretary General, things like that. Fast forward, the leadership took me to the US, so I had a good opportunity to go to Harvard Business School. And out of there, ended up at Wall Street or in finance at one of the largest and most successful hedge funds in the world ever. But this is kind of the thing that happens when you take these different paths, right? That I was having a little bit of a crisis because all my life before I was doing things that were making the world better. And now, maybe some ways finance makes the world better, but I didn't feel like I was really helping people. So I had a big fight to take a leave of absence and had the opportunity to get into a program at NASA that's called the Global Solutions Program. And I applied, since my dad is from Africa, I had a lot of ideas about how to fight poverty with technology. So I applied to the program with that in mind. But when I was there, you live on the NASA base in Silicon Valley for 3 months. I met these amazing physicians and scientists, and without having planned it, I decided I was going to join a health team. So we asked ourselves this question: what have the biggest medical breakthroughs ever been? Because if we want to have the biggest impact possible on, maybe up to 1 billion people, which was the goal of the program, where should we start? So we asked this question, and things come up like vaccines, antibiotics, things like that. Turns out that organ transplantation is also one of those things. But even if organ transplantation is amazing in the sense that you can save someone that would have died by giving them a spare part, and they basically can live on, we all know that there's so many people like Ellen here that are on that wait list, waiting for that organ transplant that could save their life, but not knowing if it's going to come in time. And unfortunately, that gap between the blue line, how many donors there are, and the gray line, how many transplants are happening, is getting just worse and worse versus the red line, which is how many people need the transplant. And if you look at the US alone, it's probably about 1 million people each year, if we had unlimited access to organ transplantation, that people's lives could be saved. And then at the same time, when we have the organ donors, a lot of the organs are not used. So 70% of hearts, for instance, are not used from the organ donors, 80% of the lungs. And why is this? A lot of reasons, but one of the big ones is that we don't have time, because once the organ is outside of the body, it starts dying. So that's why, you know, there's all of this rush with the helicopters, landing on the rooftops, transporting the organs with jets, things like that, doing the surgeries in the middle of the night, even if it's on Thanksgiving. But you all know how to slow down time, right? You put something in your refrigerator, you put something in your freezer, right? And it turns out if you do that at cryogenic temperatures, for 6 decades or so, we've known that it basically stops biological time. It doesn't matter if it's there for a day, 100 years, or even 1,000 years. But here's the problem. This water is what we are as humans, right? So this is what our organs are. And what happens when you put that broccoli in the fridge? It doesn't taste in the freezer. It doesn't taste the same way, right? Because there's been this ice formation. And if you do that with an organ, instead of looking like that healthy kidney on your right, it looks like the one on the left, totally destroyed by the ice. So we felt that we needed this Apollo program to solve this problem. How can we stop biological time? And that kind of brings us back to the beginning. So how can we do it? Well, it turns out that I was actually kidding you guys. The one on the right is actually not frozen, it's vitrified, which is a technology similar to what you do with your car in the winter when you put antifreeze so that it doesn't freeze. If you put medical grade antifreeze, you can get it to cool in a way where it's almost like putting syrup in your freezer. It's still a liquid, but it acts as if it's a solid. Or like, you know, the glass isn't really a solid if you look at the window. The problem with that, though, is that it's toxic because you're putting these chemicals in. So some of our collaborators at Harvard have solved that in one way, where they've looked at nature, and instead of using some of the chemicals, they're more using sugars. So there's some results there. If you're interested, I can share. Another thing is if you're not just doing a single cell, but you're doing a bigger tissue, is that you get mechanical stresses, right? So you can literally have the organ break apart or fracture. So what Professor Bischoff and others have been doing is looking at that problem, because it turns out that while we can cool into that syrupy state where it's a non-solid, it starts cracking when you rewarm. And actually, ice formation is a bigger risk when you rewarm also. So they had this massive result that they, on one of the top scientific journals in the world, was the cover page out of Minnesota here just a year and a half ago, where they showed that if you looked at other fields of science and technology and you brought in nanoparticles and electromagnetic frequency, you could solve this problem. So you could have no ice, no cracking, and by doing that, you can use less of those toxic chemicals or the CPAs. Other ways of doing this? Anyone knows what this is? Boiling point of water? Yeah. How about this? It's also the boiling point of water, right? If you're on the top of Mount Everest. So there's these things where systems might work in one way in one environment, but you can change them in a different environment. In the same way the boiling point changes, if you increase pressure, the risk of ice creating changes. So instead of just being in this type of search field, you have much, much more opportunity if you look at this. How about these two concepts? Anyone have an idea of what's common between the two? So they're both non-Newtonian in the sense that we think about the world as a Newtonian world, you know, Newtonian physics, the apple should fall because of gravity type of thing. Ketchup is kind of relatively solid, and then all of a sudden when you shake it, boom, it's all over your sweater, right? Quicksand is the other way. If you stand in it, you're going to sink down, but if you jump on it, you won't, or if you run across it. So could we use that? And you might have done this experiment with cornstarch, right? So a hammer, you're banking it, but you can actually let it sink in. You can do this with whole swimming pools. So what if we could use this type of technology that's never been applied in organ preservation to organ preservation? Or what if we look at nature? What can nature do? Here's an example from that. So these are Arctic wood frogs. And we're going to see the Canadian research chair in organic physiology both a mentor of mine and of Professor Bischoff. So she's putting them in the freezer. So here's Professor's story. So this is after they've been in the freezer. So there's no brain activity. There's no heartbeat. He has to be careful to not break the legs off. And here's what happens when you let it warm up. Right? So nature's already solved the problem, and now with, genomics, proteomics, systems biology, we have the tools to start applying those things to human organ systems, right? And in fact, it might be that it's not just that, we should be shooting for the sky, but if you ask NASA, they're thinking about how could we apply this so that astronauts could basically be in a hibernation state when we send them to Mars. And some people are even saying in 100 years, maybe we could use this to go to other stars. So that's, that kid who grew up, playing with Lego and all of those types of things into the student movement. Now my life is all about science. So you can really take these different paths if you're just open to following your passions. Thanks a lot.